Okay, I'm pleased to call to order the 56th public meeting of the Mass Gaming Commission on March 12th, 2013. I don't think we have minutes to approve, so we'll move on to the master schedule. Are you there yet? Yeah, I'm not sure there's too much to talk about, but we were still wrestling with issues having to do with the Category 2 license, and if you want to bring us up to speed.
What I can do before we get into that is point out that a couple of the key dates to the portion at the bottom here have been updated recently. The notice, as per the discussion from the last meeting.
This is Phase 2 regulations.
This is Phase 2 regulations. We will meet the actual Friday when those regulations are submitted, and is reflecting a slightly later, but only by a few days, publishing of the regulations compared to the previous update.
So it's June 7th is the final finished register, but people will have access to them, well, all the way along, right? Public prior to, okay.
Yeah, we have been...
Starting, when do they first get released to the public?
Well, we have a period between late March, the 30th, up until April 12th, in which all of these regulations will start appearing. We've talked about doing some perhaps on a rolling basis. The policies behind many of those have already been in place, and so it's really ongoing. But the two key dates here between March 30th and April 12th, I would propose are important dates in terms of reading actual regs.
And the May 3rd public hearing, that would be for everything? There'll be a single big hearing for final comments on everything?
On the regulations.
On all the regs of Phase 2, right.
Yep. Now, something we haven't really reflected in the schedule is something we started to refer to as Phase 2, and I think we should call it Phase 2B, just to make sure we don't get a chuckle every time we say Phase 2, Phase 2. And if there are milestones soon after to reflect Phase 2B, we should start incorporating them in this schedule. But I suspect a lot of what these drafts will, depending on how we issue these drafts, will dictate to a great degree that Phase 2B document. I can also speak to the three scenarios if you want me to, Mr. Chairman, which we haven't.
Well, if not the three scenarios, at least sort of the overall status of where we stand on where the date, the Category 2 date is today and where it may go.
Right. Well, the Commission and the public will remember that this is our current forecast and has been for a little while, in which we get all applications by for the Category 2. The portion at the bottom here is the Category 2. Category 3 is outside of this screen. I'm sorry, Category 1 is outside of this screen. The current forecast is to have all evaluations, including for Category 2, submitted to the Commission by October 5. That, we've talked about the scenarios, whether we could bring that date up a little bit, if you will, to an earlier date, and that has a real implication on the other dates, which we started to get some feedback relative to the execution of the host surrounding community agreements. So to the extent that we do that, and we have not yet decided on the scenarios, it'll have implications later on. So we're still forecasting this decision by February 2nd.
December 2nd.
I'm sorry, December 2nd.
Yeah.
February 14th is the
Right.
Category 1.
So for the time being, December 2nd stands as the targeted date for awarding this Category 2 license, and we're still in the process of seeing if we can't move that back. Okay. Okay, good.
No.
Anything else?
Well, the last thing is that we have only begun to think about, in those three scenarios, the notion of the arbitration process for the case of surrounding community agreements not being executed, and the commission determining a surrounding community once the deadline is for proposals are with the commission. So that's a number of activities that would start after the October 4th deadline. But we haven't represented it in the schedule. We only represented it in the scenarios that we discussed last time.
Right. Okay, so we're hoping there won't be any surrounding community debates. Okay, anything else? And then we're gonna be starting to add in, soon, we're gonna be starting to add in the regs for Phase 2B. Getting that scoped out up here pretty soon, but we'll get to that. Okay, anything else in administration?
I believe I included one small item as part of this relative to pre-approval of an employment and labor council. I have in the packet included a recommendation to pre-approve to qualify the firm of Morgan, Brown and Joy as a labor and employment law firm for the commission. What we currently have are only very incidental, I would pose, charges, if you will, for certain questions relative to employment law. But I think that as we continue to ramp up with employees and more staff, some of these questions will become less incidental, and we will, in the cumulative, get to surpass the incidental purchase threshold, which is why I have requested and obtained cost proposals and statements of qualifications from firms that do this kind of work, and the firm of Morgan, Brown and Joy is my recommendation for pre-qualification at this point, as they have submitted a statement of qualifications with a lot of experience, especially with agencies like the Gaming Commission in the state here in Massachusetts.
And they were also recommended as one of the three that were recommended by state's HRD.
That's right. They've done a lot of work with the lottery, with other agencies in our position, and they have great references. They have no conflicts. So we think that this is a good firm to have as part of our advisors.
Any comments on that? Want to move it?
There's no more comment. I'd move that the Gaming Commission pre-qualify the law firm of Morgan, Brown and Joy as its employment and labor counsel for miscellaneous and ongoing advice relative to employment and labor law for the commission.
Second.
Any other discussion? All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it unanimously. Investigations and Enforcement Bureau report. Director
No, Mr. Chair,
Wells is-
Director Wells had a conflict this afternoon, actually working on investigations. And so I was asked to give the report, but it's a very limited report today. The investigations are ongoing. There's daily contact with the applicants, lots of questions, lots of issues to consider, but they are ongoing as we speak, and going, I would not say according to plan, because there's always issues, but the additional redaction is being handled, as well as the investigations themselves. So that's all I have, Mr. Chair.
we released the list of all the 300-plus qualifiers that came from that department and was released by our office, which I guess is the only other development in that
Yep.
that we released the
Yes.
last couple of days. Okay. Item 5, public education and information, our ombudsman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We continue to have numerous conversations with host communities and with applicants regarding the potential RPA planning process. We anticipate that we will have a presentation to you on Thursday with 3 RPA members that can give you a little bit more detail about what our process is. Other notable development is that we have received now 2 requests for community disbursements, one from the town of Plainville and one from the city of Everett. We're processing those requests, and what they involve is, because they exceed $50,000, they involve work with the developers in order to receive dollars so that we can then in turn grant those out to the communities. And
Just, John, so the RPAs will be next Thursday, which will
no,
also.
this Thursday.
Oh, day after tomorrow. Oh,
Yep.
okay, good, okay. Okay, sorry.
And that's what I have to report.
Now, we've been talking about this on the issue of when, if ever, but when, we will require that Category 2 applicants pick a location
Yes.
and thus finalize their qualifier list, or maybe finalize their qualifier list. Where are we in that conversation?
Director Wells and I have had the conversations with the 4 applicants for Category 2 facilities, and they each have reported to us where they are in the process, what they would need for additional qualifiers, whether or not they'd be able to meet any deadlines that we set for qualifiers, and where do they stand in their development process. So we met with representatives from each of the 4 facilities, and they gave us that information.
So we have all the sites?
We have met with, no,
No.
we have met with the representatives from each of the
Right.
4 applicants, and they've told us where they are in their site development process. But 2 have identified sites, 2 do not have identified sites.
Right. And so where are we in the process of deciding when we will require that we be told?
I think what we discussed with them were 2 things. One, should there be a deadline for, should there be an additional deadline for qualifiers? And one could be a land-based site, and whether or not they'd be able to meet those deadlines for additional qualifiers. And then the second thing that we discussed was the aspirational September 1st deadline versus our current deadline, which is in December. And each of the applicants gave us the benefit of what their plans would be based on where they are currently in meeting those deadlines. I'll give you a little bit of a flavor of the conversations. The 2 applicants with the identified sites, as I reported previously, they both told us that they would be able to meet our September 1st award deadline. It's sort of instructive how they would be able to meet that deadline. They would anticipate, in order to meet that deadline, that they would probably need to have their special election, their referendum, on June 25th, the special election date. And then in order to meet that date, they would have to enter into a host community agreement on or about April 24th or April 25th, right about that time. That would enable the commission to have at least a couple of months to evaluate applications, go through any surrounding community debates or resolutions of those disputes, potential disputes. So the thing I took away from that is that with those 2 applicants that are very much ready to go, that's a very quick timetable in order for them to enter into a host community agreement. And, they report that it's very doable, and that's, after my conversations with some of those host communities, I could see how that would definitely be possible. If one does not have a site, I can't imagine how one would meet a September 1st date, because if you just take it to its logical
Right.
conclusion, host community agreement, April 24th, 25th, no identified site, really at different stages of site plan review, and then numerous conversations that would need to take place at both the host community level, but then the surrounding community level. The surrounding community discussion, you can take advantage of the time between the announcement of the referendum and the 60 days for the holding of the referendum. But for the host community agreement, that's a rather quick timetable, April 24th or April 25th, to meet the September 1st date. So then, based on some of the outlines that we just saw, you have multiple different scenarios. So if you don't meet roughly the July 25th date, potentially one could have a summer referendum. If you have a summer referendum, then your dates for concluding your host community agreement could occur a little bit later, May, June. But I guess there's a policy question on whether or not we would want to move ahead with a summer election if that is okay. Obviously, everybody doesn't take vacation at the same time, or whether or not that is less desirable. If it's less desirable, then after the summer months of July and August, then you have basically a September referendum, and a September referendum places you basically at our December 2nd date that we've had on the books so far.
Right. So this ties to another question, and if I'm jumping ahead here, somebody please tell me, but I think this is floating around, and we and our bidders need to understand where we're coming down on this. We talked last week about, our last meeting, about whether or not we would have a policy, I think, on whether a election could be set prior to a bidder being qualified. And then we've sort of said loosely that, yeah, we could, if they want to take a risk, they could do that. I think by your schedule, even the two folks that have their sites identified now, they may or may not be qualified by April 25th, right? That's probably a stretch. So they would have to set the in order to get the June 25th date, which would assure September 1st, they would have to set the referendum prior to their being qualified bidders. And we haven't really made up our minds. So, maybe moving the date back, making the date sooner for the license award, sooner than December 2nd, which is today's target date, is non-functional from any standpoint, so we shouldn't torture ourselves and keep pushing it. But if we're gonna keep that open as an option, then we have to do a number of things, including make a decision on whether or not we can select bidders, set elections before bidders are qualified, A, and B, are we gonna set a target date? We would have to set a target date, by which time we would have to be told where the sites are gonna be.
If we want to keep that December 2nd date as a real date, we have got to have the surrounding community arbitration process end by that date. And soon enough for us to award the license on that date. Because the way this schedule is framed right now, it does not, the December 2nd date does not take into account that arbitration process, which is basically a 7 or an 8 week process. So that December 2nd date really has an outside date of sometime deep in January. And it seems to me that so that's for starters. It seems to me that we should, not today, but we should soon decide on what we're going to do insofar as the target date is concerned, and set a date by which the sites have to be identified and we have to have the applications, a deadline for the RFA2 applications. Otherwise, we are simply being governed by the readiness of the applicants, and we desire competition, which is a healthy thing. We've been working on that for a long time. But competition that never materializes
Right.
into reality is not helpful to the process, I think. So it seems to me within the next couple of weeks, we ought to coalesce around some dates and communicate those dates to all of the applicants move forward from that basis.
What's your view at this point on the issue of whether or not elections could be set prior to bidders being approved?
I think we ought to allow that to happen in the interest of efficiency. And it is at a risk. Everybody has to understand that it's a risk because the qualification decision may not be made, but it seems to me that they are, the IEB process is interactive enough
Yes, it is.
that applicants are going to be able to predict with some certainty where things are going and when there'll be, when an endpoint will be reached. So that reduces the risk of inherent in setting the advance date.
Okay. Does anybody else have a strong feeling on that issue particularly?
I agree with Commissioner Q, that we should allow them to set the date, but obviously not have the referendum until
Right.
they have that information.
I agree as well, and I think, however, we should, if nothing else, reflect in the schedule what happens if somebody runs that risk and materializes against them. If, let's say, there's a scheduled election, and and the applicant is then found unsuitable or suitable with conditions, there is, if I remember correctly, applicants will not be able to request another election for some period of time.
If they lose the election.
They lose the
If
election.
they lose the
If
election.
If they cancel the election, I don't think that would.
That doesn't apply.
Okay.
Then-
You could double check that, but I don't think that
Okay,
applies.
then.
It's a negative vote that
Right.
triggers the
Yeah.
180
Okay.
days.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Then-
Well, I'm okay with that too, and I don't think we need a vote on that, because if we don't say anything, it won't be a rule, so that's fine. But I do reinforce your comments. We are on purpose keeping our deadlines flexible, because the greatest good here is optimal competition. But at some point, it becomes a problem, and it becomes inequitable to the folks who are moving more quickly. So I think I agree, whether it's a week or two, but I don't think it ought to be much more than that we put a stake in the ground as to when we need to know the sites and when applications will have to be in. Okay. Guess that was it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Preparation for Region C, there's really nothing more to say than what we've been saying before. We do have a number of people who have requested to speak. Anybody any public official or representative of an interested party is invited to let us know if they want to speak on the website. Everybody else is invited to comment, and we hope that we'll have comments, and that being on the issue of our discussion on the 21st about whether or not to open Region C to a commercial site or some other action, to commercial applications or some other action. And I think that's it for public education and information. Regulation update. Commissioner McHugh, is that?
Yes, let me just give a quick update. Yet, we have, the regulation writing process is proceeding. Yesterday, we had a meeting. I met with all of the consultants to do a read-through of the draft regulations that we have now, corrections, synthesizing. That draft will be distributed to you either today or tomorrow. There are 3 sections of the regulations that are placeholders only. One is the evaluation criteria, 2 is the evaluation process, and 3 is the sort of hearing process that we're going to use. Those are things we're going to discuss at a non-regulation level over the next few days, and then we can write regulations to fit those in. And then distribute that final draft to everybody. And at some point the week after next, I think, we would anticipate having a day or a time, perhaps even as part of this meeting, to go through the regulations after you've had a chance to read them. Make sure we all approve them and meet the March 29th date for sending them to the local government advisory committee. So that's the plan. Along the way, we'll get some other outside advice on the content, and that outside advice will be incorporated into the regs as well. So that's the process. Anticipate.
Can you characterize the meeting yesterday? Are we doing well? Are we?
Oh, yes, we have, of all the sections that we looked at yesterday, we have finished the work, basically, as far as that's done. And so the draft you see next, which is in large part a repetition of things you've already seen with some changes to it, that's done, except insofar as input from one outside agency is concerned. And I suspect those advisories will be minor. You'll see on the draft, there are 2 policy questions that remain to be answered, and we talked about those a little bit at one of our prior meetings, and that is the extent to which we want to regulate what's to happen if there are 2 proposals in a given community. Do we want to have do we want to require the elections be held on the same day? And if there are multiple host communities that have to vote, do we want to require those elections to be held on the same day? We discussed that, and I think the general thoughts were expressed, but we need to make sure that we understand what we're going to do there. But that's a simple policy decision and will not require a big change in any regulation. So we're basically
Okay, great.
done. We've gone as far as we can go until we do these next couple of things.
We had said last week that we would decide that question about if there were 2 HCA's, would we
Right.
require it, that we
Right.
would decide that this week.
Right, and we can.
So-
We can do that today, or we can do it Thursday.
Yeah. Well, I might as well, do you have an opinion on that? Or do you
I
want-
spoke to the city of Springfield about that.
Okay.
Did you?
It's only Springfield at the moment, but that could conceivably change.
Well, it's the.
No, it's
that-
2, I'm sorry, it's 2 sites, yeah.
It's 2 sites.
Yeah.
We have 2 towns and 2 proposals in a single town.
Right, yeah.
Possibilities, yeah.
So the city of Springfield reports that it is their intention to have the election for both applicants on the same date. But they did note that there's an issue within the statute that it is up to the applicant at which time they can request the referendum.
Good point.
So that there is some, some statutory hurdles that they would have to overcome. And that there could also be an issue whereby if one applicant does not proceed as quickly through our reviews, where would that put the city in a position? What would they be able to do if we were to approve one applicant, well before another applicant qualifies?
Is this the phase 1 review, John, the
Mhm.
Yeah.
suitability?
Mhm. If that were to be delayed, but they reported it is every bit their intention to host them on the same date.
Which they can clearly do. I don't see any reason why they couldn't make that a precondition of signing a host community agreement.
That could very well be
Yeah.
within their authority,
Right.
absolutely.
Even if we're delayed, seems to me that having them on the same day is, it sounds like Springfield agrees, but it seems to me that's pretty important. That would be wildly unfair. And if people were left to pick their own days, you could have all kinds of gamesmanship about who goes first and so forth and so on.
Right.
So it seems to me a pretty high priority, high enough probably that we make it a rule.
Right.
Just for the record. As it sounds like Springfield's gonna do it anyway, but.
Well, if we do make a rule, then we would have to be cognizant of the statutory requirements. They must host the special election within that 60 to 90-day period. And I guess that there could be a situation whereby that just wouldn't work out. There's some flexibility of between 60 and 90 days, but one
But then
could
they would
conceive of a
be,
window.
they would be in
But there's-
non-compliance with our rules. They wouldn't be able to make their application.
Yeah,
Well, but it could be that they can't do it because we haven't finished our,
No, because we're saying that they have to be at the same time.
no.
So if one isn't done, the other one has to wait.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
I mean, it seems to me it is within our control, and if we assert our control, it's within the community's control to make this happen. And I think it's highly unlikely that anybody would not be doing that anyway, but in the unlikely event that that could happen, I think we should preclude that.
Yeah, but I agree with your point, Mr. Chairman. We're not dictating when within the 60 to 90. That's a point of contention. We would only be dictating that if you're gonna have more than one, you have to have them in the same day, more than one host community agreement.
More than one referendum, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
You're looking troubled by that.
Well, I'm just trying to do all the math here of when you get your host community agreement versus our requirement that you cannot have your referendum until after our reviews occur. And then the community must hold the referendum within 60 to 90 days after the request from the developer. So you're having multiple different things happening at the same time, and whether or not it may work out. So to say, for example, that we establish a rule saying, just a blanket prohibition, you cannot have a referendum for more than one applicant at different times. But we have not made our determination that one is qualified. So even though a host community agreement has been executed with the applicant that has qualified, that applicant could then make a request for a special election. And would the city be within its authority to not have an election depending upon where we stand with our reviews of the Scope 1 licensing?
But the city could control that by the date on which it signs the host community.
Correct.
Right.
Yep.
Right? So the city,
City has some authority and
it's in that
control.
problem.
Yeah.
In that position, they just say, this is the agreement we're gonna do, just wait until.
But that would, what we just discussed was that we are giving some flexibility to communities to be able to predict the date upon which we're going to qualify Scope 1 licensees, license applications. So communities may be making a prediction about when that's going to come, and if it doesn't come, then you have a chicken and egg thing, because they can't call for the referendum because they can't execute their host community agreement. But we're saying, don't execute your host community agreement in order to have them on the same date.
Right.
So I'm just saying that it is a little bit more complicated than,
I don't think it's that complicated. I think
I don't either.
you're overcomplicating it in the playing out the scenarios, but I think if the city's in town, if the host community says to the two bidders, one way or the other, a precondition of us approving your community agreement is that you will agree through whatever mechanism we set up to hold your referendums on the same day. And
yeah,
they say, okay.
but by law, it's the execution of the host community agreement is the date that counts.
So they just don't execute.
They
They
just
don't
don't
sign it.
execute, they
Yes.
agree on it on principle, but they don't sign it until they have both.
But you cannot schedule your referendum until you execute your host community agreement.
That's right.
So then therefore, in order to avoid any issues, you could not execute your host community agreement.
Well, it would.
Because we're allowing people to go forward well before the Phase 1 qualification comes in.
Well, we're saying if a community wants to do that, we're not sure it's a good idea, but if a community wants to do that and can, we're not gonna bar it.
Mhm.
But this would be a situation where they couldn't.
They could not,
This is a practical matter, they couldn't, because they couldn't comply with our rules, as you're saying.
yeah.
So I.
But with the effect that Springfield would not be able to host its election until after our Phase 1 in that instance?
Not necessarily.
What was that? I didn't
I
hear what you said.
don't understand the question.
What you just said, Mr. Chairman, was that we are allowing communities to move forward on scheduling their referendums,
Pre-approval of the bidders.
pre-approval of
Right.
the bidders.
Right.
But we've also noted that.
Where they can,
Where they
and where they
can.
choose in their judgment they want to, albeit it's a risk.
Albeit it's a risk.
Right.
But then we also have a situation that It is the execution of an agreement that is the precursor to whether or not they can go ahead and have their referendum. We just said a few minutes ago that one way to control whether or not they would have referendums on the same date is that they would withhold upon the execution of those agreements. But in order to withhold upon the execution of those agreements, then they could not schedule a referendum.
Right.
So we are in effect saying that in order to comply with our rule, that they could not go forward and have an early referendum.
If it turns out that we have a bidder who's not approved, and in our iterative process with the town and the bidder, we can't give them a high degree of comfort that it'll get done. If all those things happen, yes, it would come to that. So that would be a situation where they could not schedule in advance.
And if they scheduled in advance on the anticipation that things were done, that would be one of the situations that would require them to reschedule, if it didn't happen. I mean, that was part of
So
it.
I'm thinking that maybe what you're concerned about, and the issue that is in the back of your mind is Springfield's hoping to get this done on June 25th.
Correct.
And the likelihood that we will have both of their approvals done, both their bidders qualified by April 25th is probably next to zero. So if they want to go for June 25th, which they think they can, this rule will maybe make them face the unlikelihood of June 25th, which they aren't at the moment facing,
Yes.
right? But I think that's all to the good. I mean, because for Category 1 referenda to be held, particularly in the community where there are two major proposals, to be held concomitant with the Cary special election just seems to me to be highly unlikely. It's not impossible, things happen, but, I mean, it seems highly unlikely. That's 40 days. We'd have to be done with our background investigations.
That will not be-
For two companies, 40 days from today.
That will not be done.
It's not gonna happen.
That's not, the deadlines for our investigators
Yeah.
are not until the beginning of June.
Right. So
Right,
the-
but previously we've said you can go ahead and schedule your referendum.
Right.
Upon the conclusion of your host community agreement before that date,
Correct.
which would make it possible.
Right. But then they'd be, right. they'd
But
be-
if they cannot execute their host community agreements in order to make sure that they have applicants going before the referendum at the same time, then they would not be able to meet that date.
But we've always said you could schedule the host community agreement election before the approval, phase one approval.
Correct.
Recognizing the risk that the approval wouldn't be done in time to allow you to have the election. We've just heard it's not gonna be done.
Yeah.
So as a practical matter, they can't do it.
Well,
No,
there's-
it would not be done by April 25th, but our reviews could very well be done by June 2nd, 4th, 5th, 10th, 12th, which is before the actual referendum day.
So what Springfield is probably thinking is, we know probably won't be done by April 25th. Really good chance we'll be done by June 25th. We really want to hold the election on June 25th. So in our mind's eye, they're thinking, we'll probably go ahead and take a shot and schedule. If that happened under this new scenario, there would be one possible wrinkle. They signed both host community agreements. They both agree to pick the election the same date, which is June 25th. One of them gets approved, one of them doesn't. If under that situation, do we have the authority to stop the election for the one who was approved and therefore could comply with the law that says the election is set by a time of your choice after the signing? Would we be stuck? Would we be forced to breach our own rule, that we would let one go forward?
Perhaps this is what you're alluding to, but the commission could control, at least to some degree, via the IEB, I guess the IEB could control, in the case of Springfield, to make the determination of suitability of both applicants on the same day.
Well, that's true. Yeah, it's true. Think about that. Right.
Yeah, and, potentially,
And then-
Just release the
Just release,
results.
Yeah.
so
And
then,
hopefully
then.
only
then
we will
both-
know when,
and potentially, I keep on focusing on the
And
host.
that's a recommendation to the commission, obviously.
right,
So,
right.
I keep on focusing on the execution of the host community agreement. Perhaps there's some other agreement that the applicants could agree to not request the referendum until,
Because that's the other
Something-
trigger, is
Yeah,
even though the
correct.
community agreement is signed, nothing gets scheduled until the request comes from the applicant to the community.
Correct.
Say, now I want to schedule my election.
correct. And we said previously that you can control that request
Mhm.
by controlling when they do, by a city controlling when they do their host community agreement.
Right.
Um,
But you're suggesting that a term of the host community agreement is, both host community agreements, is that they won't, that they'll jointly request an election on the same day.
And that could be a condition of their host community agreement or another instrument that
Yeah.
governs it, so that you don't get into the complications that I think I'm
Yeah.
thinking about, potentially.
This conversation is perfect evidence of why some of Mark Arsenal's from the Globe's compatriots said every time he came back from one of our meetings, he was comatose. But I mean, I think, I
That
think,
doesn't include us.
I think the bottom line is, we can, there's a way for this to be managed, even in the difficult situation of Springfield. It takes a little, as you're saying, it takes a little care. But, and I realize that Springfield, and it's not only Springfield, are still holding out the hope that they can have an election on June 25th, which is probably a long shot, but more power to them. We'll do everything we can to enable them to comply.
And I believe they've only said June in their RFPs that they've issued to date, so
Yeah.
June 25th is.
Right. But in their thought, I mean, I think we know what their
Potentially.
thought process is, so.
Well, they're
and
also
it's not
probably
just-
trying to catch people before they disappear in July and August.
Yeah, and it's not
Correct.
just Springfield, it's other communities as well. Having said all that, I think we agree with the officials in Springfield right now that it is important that the elections be held on the same day. So one way or another, I think it's important for us to state that as a matter of policy, and then we can figure out
How to work it.
it out.
Yep.
Yeah. Does somebody want to put that into a motion? I think that is something we should vote on.
What
Would require that in the case of two HCA referenda in the same city, that they be held on the same day.
That we require that?
We would require that.
All right, that means we would write a regulation that said that. That would be one of we'd answer the policy question and put it in the reg.
Right.
So I would move then that the commission require that multiple host community elections for multiple host community agreements in the same city or town be held on the same day.
Second?
Second.
Any more discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, ayes have it unanimously.
Now,
John, before you go.
the other
Right.
piece is a little more complicated. That is, do we similarly require that if a host community agreement must be approved by the voters of two towns, that both of those elections have to be held on the same day? That's more complicated because we would be requiring two sovereigns to agree. And that gets very dicey, if not beyond our powers, it seems to me.
I would agree with that. That would be impractical for us to make that
What-
requirement, in my opinion.
Set that aside for a moment. What are the pros and cons? I mean, does it matter from a public policy standpoint, one way or the other? Is there any, are we invested in any equity one way or the other?
I think we're not. Unlike the situation of the two applicants in the same city or town, where their staggered election could hugely favor one over the other.
Right.
The two adjoining towns voting on the same proposal, the timing of the election really doesn't affect the outcome. There's no staging of things. There's nothing to be gained by going first or second.
Right.
And so it seems to me that there's no interest that the commission has in ensuring the integrity of the election from the staging.
I can imagine a thought process that might go on, but I think that is between the host community and the bidder. I mean, they're gonna be negotiating the host community agreement.
Well, in this case, it's the host communities.
Yeah, I know.
Two communities.
Well, I understand,
Yeah.
but with each one,
Yeah.
you know, you could imagine a scenario where, you know, there was a strong bunch of people in community X that really didn't want it, even though there was a host community agreement, and they somehow or other negotiate to get the date postponed and when turnout will be lower. Whereas in community Y, it's a higher turnout, and they don't care, you know, but that's not our problem. I mean, there's nothing inequitable about that. That's within the authority of the communities, the community leaderships to negotiate with the bidders, so it doesn't go to the integrity of the, or equity of the process, which the previous question did, I think. Okay, anybody disagree with that? Okay, so I think we don't need to do anything on that,
Do any-
because doing nothing.
Doing nothing,
Does
just
nothing,
lets them
right.
do whatever they want to
Right,
do.
okay. Just one sec. We also had a note last week that we would discuss, that we would decide today on the issue of whether to require disclosure of anything of value, or requests, disclosure of requests for, as well as delivery of anything of value. We asked for comments. It was posted that we were asking for comments. We didn't get any comments. But that's another one that we talked about quite a bit off and on, and we had set today as a decision. And I'd be inclined to make that decision unless there's some reason not to.
We have discussed it a number of times, and I second your thought that we ought to decide it today, and that we ought to do it, and that we ought to do it in the same way we've done political contributions, which is to require disclosure from November 21, 2011, till the date the application is filed as part of the application.
Of any requests for or delivery of
Right.
anything of value to,
A town, the official of a host or surrounding community, or a host or surrounding community.
what about just institutions, an official, a town, or individuals or entities within the community? Because one of the things we talked about before is the fact that right now there's an opportunity for sort of to disadvantage the bidders, because people come to them with their hand out saying, you'd like me to be on your side, you know, why don't you make a contribution to my crumbling nonprofit building?
But that request would have to be reported.
Right. That's what you're saying, you were including that, okay.
Right.
So it's not just officials, or the town itself, the community itself, it would also be entities and individuals within the town.
Oh, no, I'm sorry.
So if the church came to you and said, we want a contribution for our annual Christmas dinner from you, Mr. Bidder,
Yeah.
should we require that to be disclosed or not?
I don't think we should. I don't think that the church people, powerful as they may be in other realms, have any control over what happens to the application. And this is designed to prevent, under color of authority or color of power, somebody from putting an unfair squeeze on an applicant.
Would it
I mean,
be-
maybe there are situations in which that's not so, but
Or
that's.
could a leader of a large group influence the vote? A
Sure.
union,
Sure.
for example,
Sure, a church.
a church.
I mean, I could be persuaded different ways on this, but it does feel to me, and we've heard, as we've traveled around, we hear talk about this, that there are in many communities, people, there's nothing wrong with it, you know, but people are the bidders are doing good works in the community in order to win friends. That's fine, totally legit. And many people in the communities are coming to the bidders knowing that they want to make friends by doing good works and are asking for support. And that creates an appearance problem. If non-NGO X announces that it gets a bunch of money from bidder Y, everybody says, oh yeah, you know what that means. I mean, there's an appearance problem, at least an appearance problem. And we're not saying you can't do it, all we're saying is that the public has a right to know it. And that in requiring that the public know it, there is some cleansing effect.
Yeah, thinking about what we heard this morning, you could also turn that around a bit and say that it is, that kind of disclosure is useful to demonstrate the ties between the applicant and community organizations, the degree to which the applicant is supporting community organizations. I mean, we heard this morning from one of the speakers, Mr. Rooney perhaps, saying that one of the mechanisms for evaluating promises would be to see the extent to which the promises are part of not mitigation, but the business model of the entity that's making the promises. And a track record of support of community organizations might be part of that, might be part of that. So that there may be two reasons, both a prophylactic reason and a business model tied to the community reason for requiring disclosures of any contributions that were made or requests that were made.
Go ahead.
Well, I just think that the easier decision is, the easy, in my view, decision is on contributions that are made. That's pretty straightforward. It's easy.
Things of value.
Things,
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's really just an administrative exercise to try to figure out whether an organization has a lot of power or not at all. But I think simple disclosure benefits the public interest. The other piece, the one trying to require that every request is disclosed, whether it was followed with a contribution or not, may become a very impractical exercise, depending on just the amount of requests, in my view. Maybe not, but I think that,
Considering the 21,000 pages that they've already put together, I don't think this is putting much of a burden on it.
Might be adding another 5,000 pages.
Yeah.
okay. Well, I draw the distinction in the actual contribution,
Well,
where I think it's easier for us to request that disclosure. I think there's a clear benefit. I'm less sure about the benefit of just trying to keep track of all the single requests that anybody gets at any given time. They have bigger things to keep track of.
I would agree. I mean, in picking up on Commissioner McHugh's point, I think there's relevance as we consider evaluation criteria to somebody who's demonstrating a partnership or a good faith effort that they're going to, relative to workforce development, or giving the community college some, whatever investments and contributions they're making. Because some they're going to want to reflect and say, we're demonstrating our good faith on XYZ evaluation criteria because we cut a check. We've also stepped up and tried to support organizations, community. Here's a check. I think to Commissioner Zuniga's point, asking them for every request they get, whether it's a formal request on a piece of paper, or they run into an executive in some public event who says, hey, hope you can come to our dinner. Is that considered a request? I think for transparency purposes, because it will reflect on our evaluation criteria to some extent. Documenting where they have actually cut a check or made an investment, I think, is helpful information to have, because I think it lends itself to the transparency as well. You know, the other contribution information about whether they have donated to political candidates, political office holders. We know that there's a period of time in which there's an outright ban. You know, if we're trying, so we hope that isn't happening in that intervening applicant period. And certainly documentation is there through campaign and political finance of any contributions made before that point.
But take the easy prophylactic case, that city councilor X goes to a bidder and says, this is my favorite charity, I'd like to have you give them some money. If we require that bidder X disclose that, that's gonna make it a little trickier for that city councilor to make that request. And everybody knows that if the bidders play by the rules, these things are gonna be on the table. I mean, it seems to me that is, it's less dramatic if it's just a nonprofit, you know, knows that they're vulnerable because they're looking for votes and they go to them and try to squeeze them for 10 grand. That's less obviously a problem. I happen to think that's a problem, and in this case, I'd want to protect the bidders by giving them the obligation to tell us. But the easier case is the public official asking for a contribution to a charity in effect, on his behalf.
Or to make a hire.
Or hire, anything of value, absolutely. Hire my cousin's wife, you know. I mean,
We've got four, maybe 6 categories. So, but I think we can narrow this down. We've got political contributions within the period. They should be reported, right? Requests for political contributions within the period. They should be reported. Things of value given to a municipal official or a host or surrounding community within the period, given, they should be reported. Requests by a public official for a contribution of a thing of value to a host or surrounding community within the period should be reported.
Read that last one back.
Yeah.
Requests by a public official for a contribution of a thing of value to a host or surrounding community within the period.
not to the community, but to anybody.
Any
Request by a
request by a
public
public
official.
official for a thing of value to be donated to
Anybody.
all right,
Okay.
accept that modification.
Yeah.
For anything of for a donation of anything of value to anybody, okay, within the period. They should be reported. Then what we were talking about is donations of a thing of value to
Any entity or
any
individual.
entity or individual in a host or surrounding community. Everybody agree that that should be reported?
That the applicant is making.
That the applicants make? All this is either requests to the applicant or the applicant making. Does everybody agree that that should be reported? Anything of value given by an applicant to anybody in a host or surrounding community since November 21, 2011.
Yep.
All right. And then the last one is any request by anybody in a host and surrounding community for a donation of anything of value since November 21, 2011. And there I sense that there is a strong negative feeling, and I join that strong negative feeling.
Yeah.
That just goes
That's my
too far.
point.
What was
I
that
don't know,
last one?
the chairman just made a pretty convincing argument.
I mean, Joe Smith goes to the applicant and says, you know, I'm good friends with Counselor Y.
Right.
I'd like you to give money to Counselor Y's favorite charity.
Right.
That would be, under my model, that would be disclosed. Under, if we don't support that, that would not be disclosed.
That's right. And your model would lead us to the leader of the parish saying to somebody in a position, come on over to our fundraising dinner tonight.
I would argue
Just buy a
that,
ticket, yeah.
I would argue that your example really falls in the second category where a public official is part of it, whether it's indirectly or directly. I mean, I think that's a distinction. If it's on behalf of somebody, on behalf of Councilor X, but it happens to be the brother-in-law, it's still Councilor X.
Now you're making the bidder be a prosecutor, trying to figure out, you know, who's doing what to whom, whose brother is this guy.
In many cases, it is not the public official who
Right,
makes
of
the
course not.
ask.
Right. And you don't know for sure whether the public official knows the ask is being made or it's arranged that it be made.
That's what wiretaps are for.
Well, I mean. I mean, it sounds like we're getting carried away here, but I'm
No.
sorry to say we're not, you know, I mean, this stuff happens all the time. And, you know, that the consequence of this participatory, locally controlled process that we are a part of and that we admire and that we think is good is that it has lots of players and lots of opportunity for a marginal player to screw up the works for everybody else by doing something stupid. And the more that we can do that puts the heat on marginal players to mind their P's and Q's, the better off we all are.
I would like to think that the bidders would be, the applicants would be in the best position than anyone else to try to read and understand whether the request comes from, directly or indirectly, somebody in a position of power, in the realm of a public official. And that we leave that, well, that's
sorry.
my thought.
Yeah, I wasn't laughing at you, I was laughing at the
At the
wiretap comment.
And we can just put it out there to say, bidders, when you feel, applicants, when you feel that you're being asked for something of value.
Why are you resistant to the idea of having them just report it automatically? as
Report
well?
everything.
Yeah.
I think it can become unwieldy and too burdensome administratively. But maybe I'm getting carried away. I don't know.
Do we give the bidder, I think, getting back to the chairman's point, a way of protecting themselves in this process? Do we give the bidder the tool of saying, I can't cut a check unless I get an official documented request? And that regulation, is that in itself enough to scare somebody who's trying to wield some influence and delete enough of a hands-off approach? I don't know. I mean,
Well, the other
the bidder has to back up every check I cut with the actual request. I don't know.
another mechanism is to establish thresholds. If anything of value is defined by some threshold, that could get to making sure that there's not an undue burden of administratively. And I mean, the other laws do that.
Well, I wouldn't have,
gifts
yeah,
and-
I wouldn't have a problem in defining thing of, you know, like to say full or part-time job or something of over $100 or something. I mean, I wouldn't have a problem with that if that made a difference. So if somebody says, come to my church cookout, which is $15, you don't have to report that. I wouldn't have a problem with that.
Could you repeat the first 2 or 3 categories that you had? You may have added some since then, but.
No, I stuck at 6. I stuck at 6 'cause
You added wiretaps.
He
No,
kept
once I-
writing, and we
yeah,
got worried.
Once I heard about the wiretaps, I decided not to go any further. Any political contributions made within the period, the period is since November 21, 2011. Any requests for political contributions within the period. Anything of value donated to a person or entity in a host community or surrounding community within the period. any request by a public official for a donation of a thing of value within a host or surrounding community during the period. And I actually combined two categories in that one. And then the final one, I've now only got 5, is any request by anybody for donation of a thing of value to a person or entity within a host or surrounding community within the period, has to be reported.
That first one, though, I'm a political candidate asking for a donation after November.
21, 2011. That's, we've already decided on, I think.
Right.
I had a question about.
Did you finish?
But did you finish?
Yeah.
No, but they're, obviously, they can't donate anything after they file their application on January 15th. They're not allowed to make a contribution during the applicant time.
That's right, but that doesn't mean
Right.
an accident didn't happen.
I mean, simply, in terms of our data collection, OCPF would have anything that was donated to a political candidate already on record for that period.
Theoretically, they would. So what we're
Theoretically.
asking is that that same information be included in the
Right.
application.
Okay.
Is there any issue with going back? Is that problematic in any way? Either remembering or changing the rules now? Is that problematic?
Insofar as donations are concerned, I think we've had that, political contributions, we've had that around for a long time in one fashion or another. I think that's, as a matter of fact, that's in the regulations we promulgated earlier. And the November 21, 2011 date is in the Phase 1 regulations.
And that's a simple matter of, they already would have had to report that anyway, so it's
Right.
compiling
Well, that's
contributions and reports.
with regard to a political.
But she's
Right.
talking about.
Talking about all the other
She's talking about
categories.
everything else.
Right.
I mean, any contributions, anything, any jobs or money, they can figure those out, that's
Yes.
no problem. You know, obviously, going back for a year and a half for requests, you know, they're gonna miss some, you know, small stuff, but, you know, but we're not setting up something where we're gonna penalize bidders here.
No.
You know, this is not you know, something where we're gonna look for enforcing and then go penalize them because they missed somebody. This is just you know, just a disclosure, a good faith disclosure effort that does give some disclosure to the public, and I think in a way, some protection to the bidders.
Well, we are going to potentially, the applicants are going to be required to disclose this information under the pains and penalties of perjury. That's what so I mean, forgetting does not violate that, right? So, but a question always arises as to whether it was a forget or a willful omission. So I mean, there is a consequence to the look back.
It's an intentional consequence.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Very similar to the investigations or
Right, right,
undertaking.
right.
There are there's an ombudsman and 2 or 3 lawyers on staff wandering around here. If anybody's got opinions on this, please pitch in.
Good. I had some questions on the breadth of the categories. For example, requests that are made by public officials for anything of value. Would that include anything that would be requested as part of the mitigation agreements? Would,
No.
if any city councilor asks for one topic or another, is that excluded? It is a request for contribution to a community. Requests from private entities, if an applicant shows up at a public meeting and 100 people show up and they each ask for something with some of the officials there, does that count as a request?
A legitimate mitigation initiative. Yeah.
I guess, but my point is
Yeah.
that if, similar to my point earlier, it gets rather complex when you're trying to actually write the rules so that you are not over-inclusive or you do not include things that, you know, I think we would all think are legitimate things that, you know, no one could be expected to write down 150 requests, some that are made in a half an hour.
If we do this, I think my suggestion would be that we agree in principle to adopt such a rule, and then asks someone like a former appellate court judge to draft one up, or maybe a general counsel to
Right.
draft one
Right.
up,
I
and
think
we'll
a
look
general
at it.
counsel would be an
Yeah,
excellent
I
idea.
think you're right. Gotta get in the habit, I gotta get in the habit, switching out now.
She already wrote it.
Get ready, Catherine. Okay, so, because you're right, this is complicated, this is more complicated than even than the other one.
Yeah.
But, so we're talking about in principle here, we're not talking about the exact language, we'll settle on the exact language. But maybe it's worth deciding either by consensus or vote if we need it, that we agree or don't on principle, and
Yeah.
then we can ask
I think that's right.
general counsel to draft something.
Right, right.
Are we okay to go forward? Are you all right with going forward to get something drafted up and take a
Yeah.
look at it? Okay. So let's do it that way, and we'll try to nail this next week.
Wait a minute, time out.
Sorry.
Part of the principle includes, having some.
Definition of thing of value.
Right, and being sensitive to what administrative burden we may or may not
Right.
impose by these
Including,
rules.
including the points
all the
that John
points.
said, right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, all right. Is everybody comfortable in principle with the omnibus requirement for disclosure of any request by anyone in any hosted
Yeah.
surrounding community for anything of value since November 21, 2011? I,
Sub-
for one, am not.
Subject to a limiting definition of thing of value, and subject to a limiting, in the ordinary course of mitigation negotiations, or something like that.
Yes, even with those two limitations, I am not comfortable with the breadth of that.
Me neither,
Which end did you drop out? The wiretaps?
and that's one.
The wiretaps. No, I think that's too broad unless, I guess the qualification, and maybe the qualification would be if the value of the thing of value was sufficiently high. It's one thing to ask for a $10,000 gift. Another thing to ask for, to use two extremes, coming to buying a ticket to the church fundraiser. So maybe I ought to just withhold that until we see what the regulation looks like.
Or give a suggestion, where would you draw that line?
Something that somebody would remember and think remarkable. In this context, it seems to me it's got to be in the multiple $1,000 range.
Well, if it were $1,000, I mean, Spiro Agnew went to jail for $6,000.
In 1975.
So, it would be
Inflation.
$15,000 now,
Inflation.
right? Well, $1,000 to an individual would be a lot of money, $1,000.
That's why I say, I would just like to see the
Yeah, okay.
regulation. Let's just see what we do.
Let's
and we can
challenge
have
our
it.
general counsel, see what she can come up with.
I think there's lots of information that an applicant or another public record source is already gonna have available to us, and it's easy to offer up, and I think we've separated out mitigation proposal or mitigation agreement request. But I'd like to find, to your point, Mr. Chairman, some way to capture what are pressure point requests or political influence requests.
And trying to remember there are two sides of the equation. One is a kind of buying of influence that, if it isn't illegal, is at least unseemly, and the public ought to know about it, on the one hand, and on the other is a taking advantage of the bidder's vulnerability right now
Yeah.
in a way which may not be illegal, but is at least unseemly. And if there were a way to get at both of those two unseemly activities, I'd be happy. But I realize it's easier said than done.
Yeah. I can see it playing out lots of different ways.
Okay,
See a
so
bidder
we're-
actually reluctant to offer up that type of information for jeopardizing their own chances. But
All right, so we'll table this till next week. Yeah. If anybody out there has thoughts, we're interested, including if you think we're wrestling with something we don't need to wrestle with. Okay. I think that was everything for regulation update, schedule update. Anything else? I guess you've spoken to that as well. Thank you,
What's
John.
the strategic check right now? Yeah.
Okay, racing division. How are you?
I'm good.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, Commissioners.
Look, you got some sun. Go
It's
skiing.
warm in the back of the room. I don't really have much of an administrative update this afternoon. I do have a correction for the record on something that I talked to you about on the 55th public meeting a week and a half ago, and that was to do with our rulemaking process. I was reminded after that meeting that our rules actually in the racing division do not take effect upon the traditional rulemaking process in Massachusetts. So there is an additional statutory requirement that the old Racing Commission and now the Gaming Commission has to comply with as part of the rulemaking process. So essentially what happens is rather than, after you approve the regulations, filing with the Secretary of Commonwealth and having them published in the register, we actually have to file with the Clerk of the Senate. So it adds some time onto our rulemaking process. They have the opportunity, let's see, it goes to the Joint Committee on Government Regulations for review, and then they have the opportunity to disapprove. So they can do that. If not, within 60 days, then these rules would take effect. So that puts us out into the live racing season. And so the choice has to be made whether or not I make the recommendation to you to adopt our rules on an emergency basis. The provision still retains that and in fact is explicit in the ability of the commission to adopt rules on an emergency basis to protect this health or safety of the public, participants, or animals. And I do think that these medication and veterinary practice regulations, I think, fall squarely within that category. And we have followed the rulemaking process, so this is not, we haven't taken any shortcuts there. We've had the public hearing on the 25th. We had a public comment period. And so to avoid the disruption to the industry that would occur if these rules went into effect in the middle of a race meet, I guess I would recommend that when I bring them to you on Thursday, that they be adopted on an emergency basis. So I wanted to correct the record, and I will be making that recommendation to you Thursday. But we do have that additional statutory requirement that I wanted to correct.
Okay.
And then a timeline correction, we were also going to bring our Phase 2 rules to you, introduce those to you on Thursday, and at the request of council, we've backed off on 2 weeks for that. And those are going to be rules that have to do with safety equipment, for example, best practices that primarily affect Suffolk Downs. And these are basically amendments to rules that are in existence. There are model rules that have already previously been adopted, and this is just bringing them up to date because the changes, they change on a periodic basis, yearly, even sometimes quarterly. So basically, these are just incorporations of the latest versions of those, but that's going to be pushed back 2 weeks.
Okay.
Which brings us to the Section 104 legislative review and what we hope may be the conclusion of this process. In the packet, we've got a proposed chapter, which in the in-house we're calling 128B. It's the next chapter that's available. That was our working title. A copy of the report, which you've seen before. And then the last comment that we received dated March 5th from the New England Horsemen's Benevolent and Protective Association, which is a thoroughbred stakeholder group, is included there as well. I don't know exactly how you want to proceed on this. Certainly you've spent quite a bit of time with the report. We've had the chapter before you for some time, so Danielle and I are happy to answer questions about any or all of the documents.
Could you explain what the premium, I read the horseman's letter. Could you explain what the essence of that controversy is?
Danielle?
let me make my question more specific.
Sure.
The role that the premiums play in affecting the life of the owners, which is the gravamen of their concerns.
Right,
As
so,
a practical matter, I understand the legislation, but just as a practical matter, how that works.
right now, the amounts paid in premiums go to the purse accounts, which essentially go back to the owners and the horsemen of the horses. No other jurisdiction that we can find has these premiums mandated in their statute. And it was our position that with the money that will be contributed from gaming, that it'll more than account for the amounts that are seen in the premium structure now. There's a little bit of contention with the different premiums that are paid between the different tracks. And there's certain tracks have exceptions to when they have to pay premiums and when they don't have to pay premiums. So the horsemen have proposed that there's a flat premium rate with no exceptions. But based on our research between the other jurisdictions that don't mandate a premium via statute at all, it was our proposal that we do away with the premium structure and the purse funding will be accounted for with the influx of the gaming money.
And I would add to that, that it seems to me, and I'm sure there's many people in the room that would perhaps concur with this, that does seem to be one of the perennial bones of contention when the statute gets re-upped, essentially. And the current structure is that there exist these premiums that have been negotiated, and then there are exemptions to the premiums. So depending on when you're simulcasting, you may or may not be paying the premiums. And so it seems as though it's a significant bone of contention. Speaking on the thoroughbred side, we did just run some numbers, and the contributions that we had in terms of what the premiums give to the overnight purse structure on a yearly basis really account for 3 or 4 days of live racing out of 100. So we do feel that it's been superseded by the money that's going to be in the development fund.
It's superseded, I'll take that at face value, but
But
it's
it's still real money.
It's money. I mean, it's coming, so it was gonna be 100, now it's gonna be 100 less, some small part of 100. And is there a good that's accomplished? I know there is. What is the good that is accomplished by eliminating the purses as an addition? I'm sorry, the premiums as an addition to the purse, to the purses?
Elegance? I think in a word.
Explain that
Yeah.
further.
So
Use a word the horseman would like a little better.
use a word the horseman would like a little better. I'm not sure that I have in my vocabulary what they would be seeking for. I mean, you've read their documents,
Yeah.
so.
Simplicity, maybe?
What's that? Simplicity.
Simplicity.
Sort of-
You know, if there were other models that we could point to and say, actually, this is common, or this is something that other states have used, and along the way, Massachusetts has sort of followed the lead, or even at one time this was common and we just haven't revisited the issue. We don't find an analogous structure anyway. Purse accounts are handled differently in other jurisdictions, and we don't find an analogy anywhere that we can point to that says it's working there. What we hear, and what you'll see in the written submissions that are attached to the report, are that this is a bone of contention for all sides, and it seemed like a way to simplify, as you say.
It's a bone of contention in that each time the negotiations occur, the parties to the negotiation have different ideas as to what the outcome should be.
That seems to be the case. I've not participated in any of these New Year's Eve sessions, but they seem to be the thing of legend.
Right, but
So-
what's wrong with that? I mean, intrinsically, what's wrong with that?
Intrinsically, there probably isn't. It's an interesting point. I mean, it's sort of the beauty of the democratic process.
Right.
So I take your point.
Or you could standardize it and have it, a premium structure that is negotiated once and lasts for 20 years. Would take care of the same issue. I don't feel like I have the competence, the knowledge to really argue this point one way or the other. And I think there is something to be said for streamlining, clarifying, simplifying, and making more elegant. And I know what you mean by elegant. I think it's a perfectly good choice of words. That makes all the sense in the world. On the other hand, in my childlike understanding of the horse economics, you know, the purse is kind of the sine qua non of what will make the industry survive or not. And if there are relatively painless ways, albeit inelegant, but painless, you know, to enhance the amount of money in the purses, maybe there's a public policy good to be said for that. So, you know, I respect you guys, and I think you've done a tremendous amount of work, and I know you've reached out to the community to talk about it a lot, and, you know, I'm inclined to go with what you think. But if I were at a legislative hearing and I were debating a point, I'd have a hard time, as Commissioner McHugh said, you know, arguing for the intrinsic value of this simplification, clarification over the intrinsic value of putting more money in the purses and what that might do for the racehorse industry in the state.
There are other ways that you can put money into the purses. You can increase percentages that go
Yeah.
to the Racehorse Development Fund, for example. The statute actually says a minimum, so provided that a minimum of the 7B simulcasting monies, a minimum of 10% go to the Racehorse Development Fund. So there are other ways that you can come at that to make sure that the purse structure is something that's sustainable for the industry.
Right.
The other stakeholders, comments on this particular issue?
Not since the report has come out.
So just the one stakeholder had a comment to the contrary with this recommendation?
And I would, actually, if I could just address that comment, just something, a point on the first page where they object to, where HVPA objects to being referred to as beneficiaries. Just for the record, the reason that we use that term is that when we looked at the statute and what would replace existing statute, we wanted to make sure that we made a list of beneficiaries. So in other words, where do the different funds go? All of the statutory distributions, and who are the beneficiaries of those? And so it certainly wasn't meant in any pejorative sense. It was merely that we wanted to account for, you know, everybody who was getting a piece of the pot, for example. We wanted to make sure that all of those were accounted for. And so that was the origin of the term beneficiary, which they found objectionable,
Right.
and
They-
I understand.
I think
Would
they
they
were-
prefer winners?
They were a little oversimplified.
Well, certainly stakeholders. I mean, absolutely stakeholders, and absolutely, you know, the participants that make the show go on, so.
I think they were oversensitive on that point. But there's another point in there that David said, there's an assertion that your facts are wrong, that there aren't other models. Do you remember that sentence?
Yeah, I think Danielle had notes on
The
that.
rebating and the
Yeah,
credit
right.
wagering?
Right.
Yeah, the Horseman had asserted that, that the other states that we looked at, their models for rebating and wagering on credit were in line with the current system in Massachusetts, which I guess we just found to be untrue. We found no other state that expressly prohibits rebating. We found a handful, I think 2 of the states that they had listed that prohibit wagering on credit. We had listed in the chart that was put together that none of these other states, or most of those states, don't expressly prohibit it as Massachusetts does in the statute. And in light of not having a prohibition, then essentially they should be allowed to wager on credit or have rebating going on in those states. So the Horseman said in their report that those states were in line with what is currently going on in Massachusetts, but we found that to not be true.
So you're recommending best practices in the industry?
Correct.
Right. Anybody else?
Yeah, this is simply a recommendation to the legislature. There'll be a legislative proceeding up there. The legislature can make
Absolutely.
its judgment,
Right.
and this is what we're recommending. And I, like you, Mr. Chairman, I'm equivocal on that, but this reflects a lot of hard work and thinking, and I'm prepared to support it. There's one technical thing, and I apologize for not bringing this up earlier, but Section 20 of the proposed legislation simply says that any reference anyplace else to 128A or C should be deemed to be a reference to this chapter, that as a technical matter won't work, because if this is passed, it'll have to be passed as part of the laborious process of going through the general laws and making the changes. And this kind of a general reference isn't going to work. So I'd recommend you just delete that and let this move forward without section 20 in it. And if this is ultimately passed, that laborious process of making all the other references and other parts of the statutes will have to be undertaken. And we can do that as well. I can explain further if anybody wants, but it seems to me that it's just a technical issue.
I actually have two comments on the proposed statute, and I talked to you briefly just yesterday, but I wanted to talk about them here. Section 5B, the assessment for operations of commission, towards the middle goes on to say that where the commission is authorized to make assessments each fiscal year on the licensee conducting racing meetings shall not exceed $750,000, which you corroborated that was language from the previous statute, and the actual numerical ceiling may make sense in my view in a system where you're reauthorizing a statute every 2 years, and that given that number could always be revisited. But since our recommendation here is one of having a statute that's in play for a number of years, I would be I wonder whether we should change that absolute number for something that is either a percentage, like in other places, either of amounts wagered, the purses, etc., or at the discretion of the commission in other ways, like the gaming statute allows us when it comes to gaming.
I had two thoughts on that subsequent to our conversation, and one is that these sort of hard numbers are kind of littered throughout the statute, and I presume other statutes in the general laws, other laws as well. So your point is well taken, and I think, I'm not a legislative expert, but it seems like there's two approaches to that. And one would be if you could tie it into some sort of, as you said, either a percentage or to some sort of index, but that kind of becomes a little unwieldy, I would imagine. The other, as you suggested, would be to have the language, a fee as from time to time the commission deems appropriate and does it in regulation. But this is a pretty substantial number. So for example, at Suffolk, this is a daily assessment. I think it's like $1,400 or $1,300. At Plainridge, it's $500 a day times 365 days. So this is pretty big money, and I think that to protect those, the people on the paying end of it, having something other than a nebulous from time to time, as the commission deems appropriate, I don't like that approach. Whether you can tie it into some sort of percentage or handle, as you say, I think that's a very interesting approach. Those numbers appear in a number of different places. There's daily license fees, there's the bond requirement. I mean, there's a number of places in this statute, and I suspect others, where those hard numbers do appear. So your point is taken right. If they haven't been revisited since 1999, for example, are they good numbers for the industry to be using? I wish I had a perfect solution to that. I don't.
You got suggestions or ideas?
Well, my suggestion would be to move away from an absolute number, but I know that that's not just the only one. That's the one that caught my eye.
Yeah, it's a big one.
It's a big one. I don't know how long it would be, even with the potential for increased activity in the short future, when that would be a concern.
Mm-hmm.
What about, I don't have well, there's two things. There's plenty of legislation, state and federal, everywhere, that this happens. You put in numbers and they just sit there for a long, long time. And, gas tax, for example, goes down every year. But so I don't think it's all that big a deal to do it. When the legislature in its wisdom thinks it's time to revisit it, it gets revisited. And if they don't think it's time to revisit it, it doesn't. But having said that, I also don't think there would be anything wrong with saying that that the commission can amend it. I mean, the commission, you know the process we're all going through, we're not gonna willy-nilly shoot ourselves in the foot. And who better to make that decision through an open participatory process with the industry than the commission? So, I probably think if I had to pick a solution, I'd pick that one. Maybe you fix it for a period of time and then say after which time it could be.
What about adjusting it for inflation? I mean, that's another way of handling the same thing. There's not too many statutes that we have that do that, and they do, you're right, they do sit around for
Forever.
ages.
Right.
And get wildly out of tune, and then there's a huge fight to get it adjusted, so, I mean, one way or the other, we could.
We have some horse racing people here. Anybody want to volunteer an opinion? You mean you weren't hanging on our every word, Gary?
Something I gotta deal with.
Did you hear this issue we were talking about?
Yes. About the sign.
Say again the number, the 750.
750,000.
Yeah, the assessment.
Assessment ceiling.
If I could just key off of what Commissioner Zuniga said, it would be interesting because, and then.
Do you mind speaking up here?
No.
Sorry, this is a little clumsy, but.
If I could key off of Commissioner Zuniga's comment about, using a model where it adjusts, and then play off of Commissioner McHugh where he says for inflation. Inflation in this particular case would be an inflation downward because of the handles that have dwindled. So our business actually is overpaying now than it has in the past 10 years, 15 years, as our handle has dwindled. So to the point of the assessments and the fees, we're still paying those fees, but we're not handling the same amount of money. So it would make perfect sense to combine both of those ideas. But other than inflation, the inflation would actually, in my opinion, would be an inflation that would be a downward. There wouldn't be inflation as the dollar is today, but inflation is.
So it wouldn't be inflation, it'd be a percent of handle.
A decrease.
It'd be a percent of handle as
I was
opposed to.
talking about our costs and the consumer price index.
Well, but that's a very important point.
Yeah.
Absolute numbers cut both ways.
Right.
They freeze you if it's
Yeah.
going up or downward. So
Right.
my point was relative to the notion of absolute numbers.
Thank you.
That's a good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, does anybody have a,
I got another comment also.
no, we
We're
gotta
gonna
finish on
resolve this one.
Oh,
You already raised one mess here.
Not off
Gotta
the
figure out
hook
this
that
mess
easy.
first, right.
Hold back.
I thought we decided.
So we're talking about, so the problem would be, if we dealt with the issue that this was raised, and the handle's shrinking, so would our operating budget, right, even though,
It is, the existing language, and we did carry it forward, that that's a cap, that assessment shall not exceed
Okay.
750,000.
So we have an opportunity to adjust it downward if AR expenses go down and B, the handle goes down.
With this language, yes.
Right.
and what's the assessment been?
It's been at 750.
It's been 750.
Yeah, and then each track share is proportional to their handle, their
Yeah.
total handle.
Right. I don't know.
Do we know why it's stated 750? Is that what it really costs? Does it cost us more to regulate this than the 750?
There's been a small surplus in years past, but there have also been a number of operational vacancies, so racing has been revenue neutral, more or less, with a small percentage, and so.
You mean the racing expenses?
You know, it seems to me, I mean, it seems to me that it is appropriately placed in the commission's hands. And working with our partner industry, you know, if the industry continues to have problems, then we're all gonna have problems, we all gotta figure out how to address them. If we can control our costs and thus reduce the assessments, fine. If we can't and the industry becomes non-viable, then we gotta deal with that. But I can't think of a better place, or if things get better with the new purse money and so forth, then we're all to the good. So I actually think it is appropriately in the commission to make this judgment. And it would be done through this same kind of process with our industry. So I think I would come back to saying, of all the choices, you know, my preference would be to have, I mean, not so much my preference, but I think the most appropriate place, most appropriate process is to put that in the hands of the commission on some kind of a routine basis.
Can I also draw a parallel to the Gaming Act, for example? The Gaming Act does give us the flexibility of having two sources. One that's set in statute by the assessment per slot machine. And that has a stated number, but also our ability to assess, you know, from time to time, our own costs. So the two, I would imagine, can work together in perpetuity to react to whatever changing conditions.
Right.
And perhaps to the point of, to the prior points made here before, if it's only one element that's an absolute number, it diminishes the ability to react to those changing conditions, because it would require a change in statute. I mean, I know that's to a great degree what you're saying, and it sounds like you and I are agreeing.
Yeah.
But I wanted to draw that distinction, which is not currently present in some of the numbers here that are in absolute terms.
Yeah, and I think rather than either a CPI or a percentage handle, which is, again, a fixed scenario that may not adapt to the circumstances, as we just heard, you know, the commission will be sitting there in an organic, interactive way, watching the industry, seeing how it's going, talking with our partners in the industry, and trying to figure out ways to maximize, you know, the revenues to our expenses without hurting the industry. And that's what we're here for. So I can't think of a better solution than that.
I mean, I have no concerns about us, but we're not gonna be here
But our
forever.
forebears.
Our successors.
Successors, right?
Could, I mean, that creates a scenario in which we could, a commission, not we, a commission could set a fee, a regulation fee that would be unbearable by or severely impinge on the ability of the tracks to operate efficiently.
Well,
But they would do that at their own peril.
Yeah, I don't
It would
know
also
why-
be the same way for us. I mean.
well, we're limited, and we wouldn't be in what, you know,
Right.
we're limited in that we can only assess
Right.
up to our operating costs.
Right.
So if we would adjust, we'd deal with that if the assessment were up to, not to exceed our operating costs for the division.
Right.
But I mean, our operating costs could become bloated.
That's right.
Yeah, but then the industry goes to the legislature and says, you gotta hammer these guys, you know, because they're not playing fair, look at these numbers. I mean, that's, would be the corrective. I mean, I think that's.
That's the way it always is supposed to work, that's right.
Well, it's also, I mean, the way it's supposed to work is we don't bloat our numbers
No,
and try to.
I know,
you
but that's, I mean, that's the way the remedy is supposed to work.
Right.
That's right, right.
I think it's,
All right.
I mean, we can abuse any system you give us, so.
Right.
But I think assuming good faith and,
Well, efficiency more than good faith.
well, both, I mean.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
So, do we want to, do we have a consensus? Do we want to talk any further about changing this one clause to accommodate Commissioner Zuniga's point? It sounds like we're all pretty much in agreement.
All we'd have to do technically would be to strike out the proviso. Right? I mean, if we were to put it totally in the hands of the commission, we just strike out that proviso, which contains the cap.
Or pursuant to the conversation that I was just hearing, so currently, right, the 750,000, which we don't exceed, is probably, if I had to guess, it's somewhere in the range of about 70% of the commission's operating budgets. Do you want to do, either strike the proviso or putting in some percentage, shall not exceed X percentage of the commission's operating cost.
Where does the other 30% come from of the operating budget?
Oh, from occupational license fees, fines,
Right.
there's other commissions, daily license fees.
You know, which together with other license fees shall not exceed the operating budget of the.
This may not be language to make on the fly.
I think that's
Yeah.
right.
If I
think
may.
that's right. I think if we agree in principle that we should not have a cap, if we agree in principle that we should not have a cap, then that ought to go back to be thought through again. Because it's not simply striking the proviso, because striking the proviso immediately gives us the power to go to the extra 30%, which is counterproductive. We don't want that.
Right.
So we have to, and we don't want anybody to have that.
So what we're really saying is we don't want the cap, but we also do want the authority properly contained.
Right.
To assess up to our operating expenses from this and other sources. So we gotta figure out how to write this.
Right. If we agree on this. in principle.
Director, where does it change at this date? Where are we in the time frame to keep this going so that we have this, the model rules, that we have this new chapter in place? Where are we there?
I think putting forth the most solid recommendation that we could to the legislature takes priority over whether it takes another week or two. I mean, I don't want trying to achieve perfection to get in the way of what's possible. I mean, we could sit here and try and make it perfect, and that, we can do that for the rest of the year, but I think that these are some significant issues that are worth revisiting. They're worth revisiting for a number of reasons, and if that takes another couple of weeks, I think it's
But we're looking at something that's designed to go into effect after July 31, 2014, right?
well, the legislature would have to take it up.
No, I understand that, but I mean, but that's the
That's-
thrust of this.
Yeah.
Right.
The
Okay,
drop
that-
deadline.
So we have the time to be thoughtful
Mhm.
about this. Okay.
Okay, so shall we just leave it the sense of the commission that we, oh, you said you had another point.
I have another
Are
one,
you
hopefully
sure?
a lot minor. Just one more. Section 6, 128P6, relative to records and books of wagers. The third sentence, third line there starts with the commission or its duly authorized representatives shall at all reasonable times have access to the records and books of any licensee. I would be in favor of striking out reasonable. And, you know, just give the commission the ability to access at all times. It doesn't mean that we will access them, and I know that part of the language here is to be reasonable, but I would also like us to preserve the discretion that at any time, whether that's 3 days in a row, and not having to be spaced by reasonability.
So you want us to have access at unreasonable times?
No, at all times.
No, but we would have it at all times. I mean.
Access doesn't mean that we will exercise it.
Right.
And here's a particular piece that I'm thinking about. I know there are electronic monitoring systems that could effectively give us access at all times. And if this language would preclude that kind of monitoring system, that's where I'm coming from. It doesn't.
I would say in that context, it would be reasonable
Yeah.
to have it be electronic at all times. I mean, the context defines reasonable, that protection. If you've got somebody running out the back door at 3 a.m. with a bag of cash, it's reasonable to go in at 3 a.m. in the morning. But it wouldn't be reasonable to go in at 3 a.m. in the morning most of the time. So, I mean, I think reasonable, I mean, we're not looking for the opportunity to go in at 3 a.m. without any cause. But I think reasonable is always determined in the context of the circumstances. I don't know, you'd probably
No,
study
I
this.
agree with that.
Yeah.
I agree with that. Reasonableness is defined by the circumstances, and I think this gives us adequate protection without without giving us permission to be overbearing on the licensee. I mean, I think that's the way, why they put the word reasonable.
Fair.
Got any
Much
more?
quicker.
Yeah.
No, that's it.
Those are good ones.
No.
Yeah, the cap,
That's
that was a very good one. Okay, so how about if we leave it as the sense of the meeting that we're fully in favor, anxious to move forward as quickly as possible, with the exception of revisiting that language pursuant to the couple of points, sort of consensus points we've made here.
And the section 20.
Right,
The section, yeah, including
Right.
section 20.
right, right. Okay,
Excellent.
Very
Thank
good.
you.
Thank you, that's a
Thank
lot
you,
of
team,
very
as well.
thoughtful work.
yeah, sure is.
Take a break, or do you think we might finish?
I think we're within,
Well, towards the end.
well, no, let's take a quick break, because I think we need to talk about what we're gonna do at the end, so let's take a break. We'll come back in 5 minutes. I think on the research agenda, item 8, all we have to say is that at 4 o'clock, we have a conference call to get more advice on helping us make a decision on the, which of the RFPs responding to our very big research proposal. And we hope that after this conference call, we will have enough data to make a decision. But we're trying like hell to get it done this week. On the evaluation criteria, we put it on the agenda so that if we had time, we could start. But I think everybody's feeling like, if I read that face correctly,
Mr. Chair, you're reading it well.
that it's been a long day, starting at 8:30. So unless there's anything else on the agenda, let's have it a motion to adjourn.
So moved. Oh, I'm sorry.
Second.
No, no, you.
Enthusiastically.
Probably she
All in
didn't jump
favor?
in fast.
All right. Thank you all very much.